In 1674, John Washington, great-grandfather of George Washington, obtained the present home site through a grant by the English Crown. The area he acquired was then, and is now, one of the most beautiful in America. Washington himself wrote that no estate in United America is more pleasantly situated than this. It lies in a high, dry, and healthy country 300 miles by water from the sea on one of the finest rivers in the world. This great plantation mansion stands today almost perfectly preserved and restored, just as it appeared 180 years ago. We must not look upon this shrine as just the site of the tomb of George and Martha Washington, but instead as a living reminder of immortality made visible, because in this house, on the magnificent grounds, or on the great piazza with its splendid view of the Maryland shore, he lives. Today, millions of visitors pay homage to this greatest of all Americans by visiting Mount Vernon to see and hear the true story of this remarkable estate that is imbued with the spirit of George Washington. In this drawing of the Mansion House complex, you see George Washington's own plan for his formal grounds. Washington's father, Augustine Washington, built the first portion of the existing mansion. However, what Mount Vernon became and is today is due almost entirely to the loving efforts of George Washington and to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, dedicated since 1858 to the preservation of his home. George Washington's Mount Vernon estate of over 8,000 acres was divided into 5 separate farms, each a complete unit with its overseer, workers, livestock, farmlands, equipment, and buildings. Today, the 4 outlying farms are gone, but the main farm with its great house is intact and is known as the Mansion House Farm. This is a view of the Mansion House Farm gate. Although George Washington's stay at Mount Vernon was constantly interrupted by the call to serve his country, he was known as one of the most progressive farmers of his day. He was a keen observer of crops and farm methods, even when military problems or affairs of state weighed heavily upon him. Here is the old seed house and paddock wall, which are still intact today. The Mansion House Farm was not a farm in the usual sense of the word. No large-scale crops were grown, but a kitchen garden was maintained close to the house. The garden has been accurately restored from Washington's writings and reports to his gardener. In 1785, Washington built a handsome greenhouse. He derived vast pleasure from the growing of plants from all over the world. The greenhouse was destroyed by fire in 1835. The present structures on the same site were reconstructed after intensive research and investigation. Let the house in the upper garden called the schoolhouse be cleaned and got in order against I return, instructed George Washington to his manager, William Pierce, May 15, 1796. Mrs. Washington's grandchildren may have been tutored in this small octagonal building during good weather. George Washington acquired his boyhood home, Mount Vernon, in 1754 after the death of his elder half-brother. At that time, the house was 1.5 stories, of modest size, with a central hall and 4 small rooms on the first floor. Prior to his marriage, the mansion was raised from 1.5 to 2.5 stories and extensively redecorated. The east front view facing the Potomac River displays the most striking feature of the mansion: the innovation by Washington of the high columned piazza extending the full length of the house. The exterior finish of the mansion is an unusual feature. Most believe it to be masonry. Actually, wood siding was beveled to give the appearance of stone, and then sand was applied while the paint was still fresh. This process is known as rustication. Here is the northern end of the mansion, featuring the Palladian window. Now we see the same Palladian window from the inside. This large dining room is one of the best examples of the unusual nature of Washington's administration of his vast estate. Although seldom home during the war and his presidency, he still managed to participate directly through correspondence in all planning, construction, and management of the mansion and grounds. The large dining room was built during the Revolutionary War by Washington's wartime manager, Lund Washington. In 1776, while heavily menaced by the British Army and the dwindling of his own military power, he still found time to write Lund with instructions on the placement of the chimney and how various other constructions and decorations were to be carried out. A truly remarkable man once again displayed his infinite love for his home. The central passage extended the full width of the house, from the front door on the courtyard side to the huge piazza overlooking the river. Located here is this perfectly preserved central hall staircase. Washington cherished his family and his life with them. In addition to his two stepchildren, John Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis, he also accepted custody of two of Martha's grandchildren after the death of their father in 1781. General and Mrs. Washington with these wards, George Washington Parke Custis and Eleanor Parke Custis, are shown inspecting a map of the Potomac and the capital city in this 1796 painting by Savage. This is known as the Little Parlor. Music played an important part in the life of Mount Vernon. In 1793, Washington imported from London the harpsichord that you see here. During the period between the death of Martha and the acquisition of the estate by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, much of the original furnishings and fittings of the estate had been sold or given to relatives and friends. Thanks to the wonderful work accomplished by this dedicated group, which has maintained and operated the Mount Vernon estate since 1858, the collection of the original items has steadily grown by gift, loan, and purchase. Here is Mrs. Washington's tea service displayed in the West Parlor. This is the small dining room, as it has been called to distinguish it from the large dining room at the north end of the mansion. It's a very beautiful room, decorated by two master craftsmen in 1775, but rather small to accommodate the numerous guests who so frequently gathered at Mount Vernon after the Revolution. This view is of the downstairs bedroom, which was a common feature of the early Virginia homes. The post-revolutionary family of Washington numbered 8 persons, including his 2 male secretaries. The family occupied the rooms on the second floor. Mount Vernon was a continual stopover for overnight guests, and they certainly must have taxed the sleeping facilities of the house. There are 5 bedchambers on the second floor of the mansion, in addition to Washington's master bedroom over the study. This was the bedroom of Nellie Custis, Mrs. Washington's youngest granddaughter, who was a member of the household since childhood. This is General Washington's bedroom. A narrow stairway from the floor below afforded Washington a measure of privacy in the house constantly filled with guests. In this room and on this bed, George Washington passed away on the 14th of December, 1799. George Washington was especially fond of Windsor chairs and ordered several dozen of them for use at Mount Vernon. These Windsor chairs are in the third-floor room Martha Washington occupied after the death of her husband. Her sewing basket rests on the floor to the right. Research indicates that a Franklin stove heated the room. The study was an important feature of the enlarged mansion. It was finished before Washington departed to attend the Second Continental Congress. No room in the mansion is more intimately associated with his life at Mount Vernon, for it was here that he spent a great deal of time and directed the management of his estate. This is the Sweetmeat Closet. Here was stored, under the care of the butler, the family tableware in daily use. On the floor, through a small door, is a model of the Bastille given to Washington by General Lafayette in 1790. The word dependencies designates buildings and houses that were used for specific purposes on the Mount Vernon estate. 2 of these, the kitchen and storehouse, are seen here. In the right foreground is what was known as Servants' Hall, a two-story dwelling of 4 rooms situated across the yard from the kitchen. In addition to its use as a family dwelling by the manager, Washington designated that it was to be used by house strangers. The strangers were, of course, visitors who, by common custom, were accorded the hospitality of Mount Vernon. The kitchen was of necessity one of the mainstays of the farm. The staff included 2 cooks and 2 waiters who were under the direction of a steward. They were constantly prepared for large company, and it was a rare occasion when there were no guests. Breakfast was served at 7 a.m., dinner promptly at 3 p.m., tea at 6 p.m., and supper at 9 p.m. The dinner consisted of such main courses as roasted pig, boiled leg of lamb, or roasted fowl, along with all the assorted side dishes. Here is the scullery. Washington was a kind and generous man. His purse and granaries were always open to his less fortunate neighbors. His manager was instructed to let no one go away hungry and to supply necessaries to the poor. The kitchen larder is where food supplies and meats were stored, some after being smoked in the smokehouse that was located on one of the farms. The storehouse was used both by the overseers and the storekeepers. Here were kept all sorts of tools and supplies, nails for the carpenter, cloth for the tailor, leather for the shoemaker. These craftsmen served the needs of the residents of the estate. For example, in 1 year, the shoemaker finished 217 pairs of shoes while mending 99. The mansion house was, in a way, a seat of government for the estate. It was, in a sense, a small empire for which Washington planned well. In 1786, there were about 90 slaves in residence at the Mansion House farm alone. In addition, over 150 other persons lived on the other 4 farms. Of necessity, and as nearly as possible, the estate was self-supporting. In the spinning house, 10 or more women were constantly employed spinning and knitting wool, flax, and cotton fibers, which were grown on the estate farms. Here is the West Quarters building. These subsidiary buildings housed many people supplying a variety of necessary duties. Carefully developed plans brought these people in close proximity to the house, but incorporated them in harmonious units. As we tour these many buildings, we marvel at the brilliance of Washington, at his foresight and careful planning. Here he displayed the same methodical and brilliant genius that shaped and formed our nation during its early years. The brick stable was built in 1782. It was reserved for the use of the family coach and saddle horses and those of their guests. General Washington was an outstanding horseman. The coach compartment of the stable housed the family coach. In the stable today, you see a coach that belonged to Washington's good friend, the mayor of Philadelphia, Samuel Powell. It is believed to be identical to one of Washington's own coaches. Displayed here is a lighter vehicle, known as a riding chair. This simple vehicle belonged to Washington's friend and patron, Lord Fairfax. The totally reconstructed grist mill is located on Dogue Creek, on one of Washington's former farms, 2 miles from the mansion. He bequeathed it in about 2,000 acres to his nephew, Lawrence Lewis, and his wife, Nellie Custis Lewis. Within this enclosure rest the earthly remains of General and President George Washington and his wife Martha. The construction of this vault was requested in his last will and testament. Viewed from the piazza, the Potomac flows softly past Washington's beloved home. We have seen its almost unbelievable history, its unique position in American folklore, the great legacy that it leaves for all Americans and all peoples everywhere, the call to individual freedom. We have seen the genius once again of our founding father, of his great wisdom, of his kind compassion for others, of his ability to create a lasting heritage for all.